Right then, where are we? Oh boy, this is supposed to be. Alright. What the hell? I mean, things happen how they happen, right? What's up, everybody? It's your boy, Ralph Anthony Garcia, also known as R4. Now, welcome to another edition to Ralph Reads Raw. And we're going to be reading Donald Goines' Swamp Man. Alright then, let's not waste any more time and give a big shout to the executive producers, Alicia B., J. Bobo, Nardowick, Maya Jackson, Scooby, Annika Evans, Rashidi Smith, Lanasia Cornish, Nana James, Dre Smooth, salute to you, ha, boom. Lanasia Cornish, Nana James, Supreme Goddess Nikki, Alasia Ross, right? Alasia Ross, Lovey Parker, Marvin Kuntz, P Money, Chris Johnson, Stephen Wade, Glenda Harper, K. Marie Billingsley, I've been the healer, Damian Irving, Sweet D, Cynthia, Lost Roads, Keith Woods, Queen Maria da Silva, T Money Money, S Salahuddin, pardon the disrespect, 704 Liquor House Talk Network, Papa Perk, Anaya Drake, Sherelle 5150, C's all the time, Trey Noel, Toedi, Tequila Green, Mr. Light, Goose Jack, Des Juan Manuel, the fourth, Lady Rain, 808. I see you here in the house too. Hey to you too, royalty. Let's go. Pretty Ricky, 22, Desmond Thomas, Dario Carrington, Marcus Valentine, Kala Isla, BLE 007, Michael Woodford, Pat Master OST, Anthony Leach, Calm Tama, Mr. Fulltime, Brian Latham, Mr. T, John Logic and Friends, and the Ranters Union. Salute to all. I'll smoke a blunt with you for a chapter though. All right then. I was literally sitting here waiting for you to go live so I can head for the gym. All right then. We're all getting strong tonight, all right? Let's do this right now. Swamp Man, y'all. Yeah, stop. Chapter 12. Sheriff Ed listened to the thunder and glanced up at the sky. 1 second. Hey. Okay, let's try that again. Chapter 12. Wait. Chapter 12. Chapter 12. Sheriff Ed listened to the thunder and glanced up at the sky. He figured he still had a few hours yet before darkness set in, but the sound of the thunder was something else again. The last thing he wanted was to get trapped back in the swamps if a storm broke out. The storm wasn't that bad by itself, but with a killer stalking them, it would only serve to make things quite a bit worse. The sheriff walked back and checked on the wounded man. He didn't really care about Zeke Jones one way or the other, but the man was going to cause problems if he didn't hurry up and die. Sheriff Ed examined the wound carefully, stroking the heavy gray beard on his chin as he went over the possibilities he had. Either he could head back toward town, or let the two living brothers take the wounded man back themselves while he and his deputy got onto the bushwhackers' trail. There was a problem there too, he reflected. His deputy just might have other plans since his brother was dead. Jericho might want to bury his brother right away. It was hard to tell what went on in a man's mind, and a mind like Jericho was extra hard to figure out. Lady Jane Gould, salute to you. Everybody give her a big shout and go check out her music. Her music's dope. All right then. Sheriff Ed walked over to where Jericho sat beside his dead brother. Jericho, he began, I've been trying to figure out just what we ought to do. He hesitated for a second to see if the man was listening to what he said. Now, we could take the body back to town and give him a decent funeral while the killer gets away, or we can get on that bastard's trail and run him aground before the sun sets again. After Ed finished speaking, he stood silently by and waited for the grief-stricken man to make up his mind. There was such an intense, pained look on Jericho's face that Sheriff Ed wondered if the man would be any help after all. Whoever went with him would have to have his mind right, or he'd end up dead. I don't reckon it would do no good to take my brother back to town, Ed, Jericho began softly. He wouldn't have cared about having people at his funeral who didn't bother to speak to him while he was living. So I reckon I'll find somewhere around here in the backwaters and bury him. Maybe I'll make a good marker one day and bring it back so I can recognize the spot where he's at. Jake walked over to the two men. You ain't got to bury him back here if you don't care to, Jericho. You can take him up to our place and put him under where my pa's buried at. That is, if you don't mind it, 'cause we'd be right proud having him buried on our place. I don't reckon I'd mind at all, Jake, Jericho replied. Fact is, I'd be mighty beholden to you for letting me bury him around other white folks. None of the men missed the insinuation. None of the men, damn it. None of the men, oh. None of the men missed the insinuation, and least of all, Jake. When he offered a chance to bury the boy on his property next to his own people, it meant that he was giving the dead man all the respect due another white man. There was no way in the world that he would have offered to bury Jitty on his land if he hadn't been white. It was unheard of in that part of the country to bury a black man next to a white man, no matter how much the black might have been respected. That's fine, just fine, Sheriff Ed stated, ready now to get his posse started. Now, we're going to have to fix up something to carry old Zeke on. He was thinking of the time involved. He had received a small break when Jake made his offer. Now he wouldn't have to worry about going all the way back to town first before getting on the trail of the black. You got some kind of idea who we might be after, Sheriff? Jake inquired as he shifted his rifle around his arms and started out over the water to the opposite bank. Check your mic, R4. Oh, crap. Can you hear me? Oh, sheesh. Hold on. Damn. This is exactly what I feared. Can anyone hear me? 1 2 1 2. Damn. Yo, can y'all hear me? Please say y'all can hear me. Can anyone hear me now? Crap of life. You know what? If that's the case, can anyone hear me? 1 2 1 2. You can hear me? Can't hear you. Cool. All right, let's try this again. I reckon, Sheriff. I reckon, Sheriff Ed replied, walking away and speaking over his shoulder. We better get busy finding some kind of sapling that we can make a stretcher out of. With that stomach wound, Zeke gonna be hard to move. With that stomach wound, Zeke gonna be hard to move. Ed walked off into Ed walked off into the nearby woods and began searching for a strong sapling, strong and began searching for a strong and began searching for a strong sapling, all the time wishing the man would hurry up and pass away. There was nothing they could do for the wounded man. In fact, the sheriff reflected as he ambled through the woods, he didn't believe even a doctor could do anything for he didn't believe even a doctor could do anything much for Jake. The man had taken too much buckshot in the stomach. It was just a matter of time now. Sheriff Ed killed as much time as he could back in the woods, praying that Zeke would go ahead and do them the favor of dying. At least they only had to go back to the Jones farm, and maybe the wounded man wouldn't be too much of a problem. Once they got him there, they could let the woman folk fuss over him and get on about their business. When the sheriff returned, and I'm sorry for constantly messing up. When the sheriff returned from the woods, Sonny Boy and Jake had already built a small stretcher. As he approached, they were lifting the unconscious man and placing him on the homemade stretcher. Zeke cried out in pain, reminding the sheriff that the man was still holding on. Meanwhile, Jericho lifted his dead brother up in his arms and carried him down to the bank of their dugout. Sheriff Ed followed, his old shotgun cradled across his arms. He searched the opposite bank, planning on not being taken by surprise again. Excuse me, folks. After placing Jitty in the bottom of their dugout, Jericho spoke to the sheriff. In case something should happen to you, Ed, I think I'm entitled to know who the hell you think it might be we're after. His voice was toneless, revealing none of the emotion his face had betrayed earlier. Whenever the sheriff was considering something, he was in the habit of stroking his gray beard. Now, as he thought over Jericho's request, his hand went up to his chin. I reckon you got a point there, Jericho. You can never tell about these things either. No, sir. It just might be my time to go after all. The sound of thunder cracked overhead. The storm was coming closer, but neither man paid any attention to it. Jericho kept his eyes on the sheriff, waiting for a reply. Sonny Boy and Jake walked past, carrying their brother. Sheriff Ed waited until they had put him in a dugout. Jake returned from the river and stood in front of the sheriff. I reckon we all would take it kindly if you give us your opinion about this motherfucking bastard, Ed. Before we go off half-cocked and kill us a bunch of niggers, Jake stated harshly, implying that he also had an idea who the ambusher might be.
Uh-huh, Sheriff Ed began. Sheriff Ed began. Now, boys, I want you to know we ain't got no kind of evidence to prove me right, but I got a hunch. It's that young Black George. He watched their faces as he spoke, but there was no surprise on them. It was as if both men expected him to say just what he said. It's how I figured, Ed. It's how I figured it, Ed, Jake began. That Nick. That nigger been brooding over what happened to his sister all this time and just found the balls to try and do something about it. It's a little deeper than that, the sheriff answered, watching his deputy closely. You boys also hung his father. Also hung his father, if I remember correctly. So, I reckon he had that in mind too when he decided to even up the score. Even up the score, my ass, Jericho cursed. My brother ain't done nothing to him or his family, so he wouldn't have no cause to ambush Jitty. So he wouldn't have no cause to ambush Jitty like that. There was a bewilderment in the man's voice. There was a bewilderment in the man's voice as he spoke, but his eyes were alive. They glittered dangerously as he continued. No, by God, ain't no right in it at all. That nigger done killed Jenny. Done killed Jitty. And somebody gonna pay for it too. You could bet your ass on it. Jericho turned on his heel and walked quickly toward the waiting boats. Jericho turned on his heels and got on the waiting boat. Jericho turned on his heels and walked quickly towards the waiting boats. He's got a point there, Sheriff, Chase said as he walked beside the sheriff down to the river. The boy ain't had no cause to ambush Jitty, so why the hell would he kill a man? Why the hell would he kill a man? Ain't never done shit to him. Sheriff Ed didn't know the answer to that one, but he had a good idea. As he thought about it, an alarm went off in his mind. The boy didn't have any reason to kill Jitty, but he had done it. It was possible that the angry black man wanted to kill everyone that was white. Having kept his anger bottled up for so long, anything white would be fair game for the black man. But it went even deeper than that. There was something that kept trying to come to the surface in his mind, but Ed just couldn't put his finger on it. There had to be a reason for what George had done. A man didn't just plan something for years, then start killing without some kind of real motivation. When they reached the dugouts, Sheriff Ed hesitated for a second. Suddenly his old wrinkled face lit up. Suddenly his old wrinkled face lit up like a Christmas tree. Boys, he began, I think I know what's in that coon's mind. Yes, sir. I done put my finger right on it, Jake. You and Sonny Boy take the right side of the river. Me and Jericho, we'll paddle down the left. We gonna paddle down the left side. Somewhere between here and you boys' place, that nigger's gonna make his move. That nigger's gonna make his move. At the sound of the sheriff's words, Sonny Boy's face went white as a sheet. Sheriff, you don't reckon he's gonna try and ambush us again, do you? The fear in the young man's voice was evident. He couldn't conceal the terror that was inside of him. I reckon he is, Sonny Boy, Sheriff Ed stated, then asked, You ain't afraid, boy, is you? The sheriff made a dry sound that was supposed to pass for laughter. Boy, as many times as you went on over to that boy's place and put the meat to his sister, I know you ain't scared now. Jericho stared coldly at Sonny Boy. It wasn't hard to read what was in his mind. If it hadn't been for the Jones brothers abusing the girl, his brother would be alive. The only thing that kept his anger from coming down on the Jones brothers was that the killer was still free. Once they'd had him, Jericho had plans for the brothers who came out of it alive. Well, I don't give a shit what y'all think about that nigger, Jake stated. Me for one, ain't afraid of him, nor anything else black like him. I just pray he gets in the sight of my rifle. That's all. The sheriff chuckled. By God, that's right, Jake. That old gun you carry happens to be the one you took from that boy's daddy a while back, isn't it? Jake stared blankly at the sheriff. I done told you, Sheriff. That nigger sold me this rifle. So when he went and got himself hung, it wasn't 'cause of no old gun. The sheriff's laugh was cold and brittle. I don't have no pity for you Jones boys, he stated, 'cause y'all done brought all these problems down on yourselves. I just hate it that I done lost a good deputy because of you fucking bastards. It was out in the open now. Without thinking, the sheriff had opened a wound that would have been better all around had it remained closed. What the brooding Jericho had thought about was now a spoken reality. Christ almighty, Sheriff! Christ almighty, Sheriff! Sonny Boy yelled. How the fuck you figure like that beast of shit? How the fuck you figure like that beats the shit out of me? He glanced out of the corner of his eye to see how Jericho was taking it. What he saw, he didn't like. The tall, silent man was glaring at Jake's back. It didn't take a mind reader to know what he was thinking. The man looked like a wild beast of prey, ready to leap on a weaker foe. Son of a bitch, Sheriff Ed cursed under his breath. Before he even got his posse out of the swamps, there would be trouble. He could read the signs, and from what he saw, he didn't like it. He believed that if he didn't watch them closely, he'd have to take Jericho back in handcuffs. Murder was on this man's mind. There was little doubt about it. Now, he would have to make sure they stayed apart. If not, Sonny Boy would end up saying something wrong and they'd catch pure hell trying to separate the two men. Sheriff Ed believed would have enough sense to stay out of the man's way, but Sonny Boy wouldn't have that kind of sense. A loud scream of pain came from the Joneses' dugout. Damn, if this keeps up, the sheriff thought angrily, the ambusher would hear them coming a mile off. It would make his job a hell of a lot easier, knowing that his prey was coming before they even got there. Okay now, Jake, Sheriff Ed warned. You boys keep a sharp watch on your side of the river. Don't forget, whoever the killer is, he plays for keeps. That warning was unnecessary. All the men had to do was glance at their dying brother in the bottom of the boat to know that the sniper wasn't playing games. Jericho, you better keep your eyes on our side of the river instead of glaring across them Jones boys, the sheriff warned. Damn it. damn trucks. Jericho, you better keep your eyes on our side of the river instead of glaring across instead of glaring across at them Jones boys, the sheriff warned. You might not get a chance to put them thoughts of yours to work if you ain't almighty careful. Jericho grunted. Jericho grunted, but he stopped looking across the two brothers. At the two brothers. The men lowered their dugouts into the water and began poling. The creek became wider, and soon there was 50 feet between the two boats. The small posse made its way down the river in silence. Each man personally in the hunt. Jericho found himself suddenly in the role of an avenger. His thoughts were indeed black. If they ever went ashore, when he got the chance, Wild Donkey, salute to you. I see you, my friend. Big respect, all four. Salute to you, Wild Donkey. Jericho found himself suddenly in the role of an avenger. His thoughts were indeed black. If they ever went ashore and he got the chance, he swore to himself that he would kill the first Jones brother he could. As his eyes searched the riverbanks on his side, he figured the long 30-06. The rifle was a new model. Jitty had used the old barrel shotgun. It had been decided between the brothers that Jericho would own the new gun while they saved up enough money for a rifle for Jitty. The thought of Jitty enraged Psych. Wait. Whew. The thought of Jitty enraged Jericho. He fought down the desire to take his rifle and cut down the two men across from him. He remembered the stories of how the Jones boys had the childlike black girl trained to come at their whistle. The nights he and Jitty had spent in their small cabin, talking about how a man could live with his sister and turn a deaf ear to that whistle coming from the swamps at any time of the night. As Jericho thought about it, he remembered the night he and Jitty had followed the Jones. He remembered the night he and Jitty had followed the Jones boys from town and watching them from behind some trees as they raped the young girl. He remembers seeing the tall black man who crept from the rear of his cabin and watched the white men rape his sister over and over and over and over and over again. Many nights after that, he and his brother had laid on their separate bunks and talked about it, wondering what went through the black man's mind as he observed his sister being turned into a garbage can for the amusement of the Jones boys. Lightning flashed across the darkening sky. It was too early for the natural darkness of evening. It was too early for the natural darkness of evening to set in, and the storm was almost upon them. Jake rode in the front of his dugout while Sonny Boy did the poling from the rear. Jake had keener eyesight than his brother, so he took the point. In their sheriff's boat, Jericho rode point. Being a younger man than the sheriff, it was accepted that he had better sight, even though the old gray-bearded sheriff was pretty keen-eyed himself. Ed, Jericho began speaking. Jericho began speaking quietly so that his voice wouldn't carry. You really expect trouble from the boy? Uh-huh. Well, I gotta figure, Jericho, the boy don't plan on letting none of us leave the swamps alive. I hadn't thought of it like that, Jericho replied quickly. I sure in the hell hadn't. Jericho smiled. If the sheriff was right, then he'd get the chance he was hoping for. Just the opportunity to flush out the killer of his brother. Then he could take care of the men who were responsible for the man becoming the killer in the first place. Suppose it ain't the boy, Sheriff, Jericho asked. If it ain't the boy Jericho, I'll eat that shotgun you got. After a brief silence, Jericho spoke again. I reckon the boy had reasons for killing these Jones boys. I reckon the boy had reasons for killing these Jones boys, Ed, but he ain't had no cause to hurt Jitty, Jericho said in a voice crackling with emotion. Nah, he ain't had no reason to hurt Jitty, son, so he gonna pay for it. I promise you that much, Jericho. Even though it ain't much for the life of your brother, Jitty was a good man, son, as you know. I always respected him, just like I respect you, the sheriff said, then added, so please, don't do nothing that will make me have to hunt you down. These old swamps ain't no fun for an old man like me. And knowing you do the same thing the coon is doing, hiding out somewhere back in there, causing me to have to spend a lot of time digging you out. For some reason, the normally quiet Jericho wanted to talk. He kept a sharp watch, even as he continued to question the sheriff. I remember that girl, Henrietta, Sheriff. She done us a good turn once. I mean, you know how it is. Me and my brother ain't never had no book learning, but that gal took her time and taught Jitty how to write his name. Yes, sir. She really done it. He was sure proud of it, too. The sheriff remained silent, letting the man talk himself out. He knew that the man's moody nature demanded some sort of outlet for the anger that was inside of him. He couldn't remain silent because there was too much to think about. Jitty come across her fishing one day. Oh, it was some spell ago, 4, 5 years ago, Sheriff. Anyhow, she had one of them there books with her, you know, the kind that don't have pictures at all. The man fell silent, trying to get the right words before continuing. Anyways, Ed, somehow or another, Jitty lets her know he can't read, so right off she begins teaching him how to read and put his name down on paper. Right after that, she goes off to school somewheres, or Jitty would have learned more than he'd done from her. There was nothing the sheriff could think of to say. Jericho continued speaking slowly. Anyways, Ed, after she come back and Jitty hears 'bout what happened to her, he takes him a trip back in the swamps to see for himself. You know, people been talking about the change in the girl, so he comes and find out for himself. Well, Sheriff, ain't never been nothing between them but friendship. But after Jitty done seen what them Jones boys done gone and did to that girl, I had one hell of a time keeping him from sticking his knife into whichever one he seen. A vine hanging down gave them a scare. Jericho used his pole to brush it aside. Jitty was so shook up by it, Jericho continued after lowering his pole back into the water. He drugged me along one night after the Jones boys did some bragging in town about where they was going. Well, we followed them. Seeing how they used that old gal made me mad as hell myself. But I had to hold on to my temper because Jitty was all for busting in on them and killing the lot. Yes, sir. Had to damn near drag him away. So I understand why the boy would be wanting to kill the Jones boys. But for the life of me, can't figure out why he'd ambush Jitty Just can't figure it out, Ed. Just can't see no reason for it unless the boy's gone mad. Way I figure it, Jericho, the boy ain't mad at all. He got a plan, all right. The sheriff stopped. The sheriff stopped pulling for a minute. The way the boy figures it, Jericho, Jitty had to die. Jitty had to die. Sheriff Ed waited for his words to reach the man. Yeah, the nigger got it all planned out. If he gets rid of all of us back here tonight, well, there won't be no witnesses against him. You follow me? Jericho shook.
Apologies. Oh my gosh, man. This really my apologies. All right, here we go again. I gotta check the mic. Can y'all hear me? Oh man, this sucks. My apologies, folks. Damn. Can anyone hear me right now? 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. Oh boy, oh boy. Anyways, let's go. Jericho shook his head in agreement. I can see where that makes a little sense, he stated, chewing on the words as if they were a piece of meat. You can bet on it, the sheriff continued. If he knocks us all off back here in the swamps, hell, it ain't enough men in town with balls enough to even come back here searching for the remains. Hell's fire. All they do is sit around drinking corn liquor and wonder whatever happened to the old sheriff and the Jones boys. By the time they got through guessing Jericho, they'd have you and your brother marked down as the killers, and swear both of you are somewhere back here in the swamps hiding out. Again, the silence fell between the men as the sheriff gave Jericho time enough to ponder over his words. When he guessed that Jericho understood what he was saying, he continued. They'd have to guess that either you and Jitty did it, or possibly the Jones brothers, because they never would give a nigger that much sense or nerve. No, sir. It never would enter their minds that a young black man did away with us. That was something Jericho could understand. He knew the workings of the southern white man's mind. For them to believe one black man had the nerve to kill 5 or 6 white men was beyond comprehension. A black man killing one white man, yes, they would understand that happening. But 6 white men? Impossible. The black man able to do such a thing hadn't been born yet. Oh my God! Help me, Jesus! Please, oh Lord! The cries were loud and clear as Zeke screamed out in agonizing pain. Jake started to leave his front seat, but the sharp warning from the sheriff sent him back to his place in the front of the dugout. If you don't keep your eyes peeled, Jake, it might be more than one wounded man we're going to end up carrying home, the sheriff called out as he pointed ahead. We come into the Big Bend, so be careful. The boy going to have to make his move soon, or he'll lose out on his chances. The Big Bend was to turn off from the main body of water. What they were traveling down now was only a small creek that led into the swamp. Not all the small creeks led back to the main body of water, so the trick was not to lose yourself down one of these many small creeks that led to nowhere. The creeks wound their way around the many tiny the creeks wound their way around the many tiny islands, some of which were completely covered with water. Getting lost in that maze was comparable to suicide. Normally, Jake in the lead boat would have been a sitting duck, but because he was prepared, he gave himself a chance. As the dugouts approached open water, the men in both boats began to relax. The only danger that could come to them now was from the last island they had passed. As long as they stayed in the middle of the large lake, there was as long as they stayed in the middle of the large lake, there was nothing to fear. They could see everything there was to see, and soon they would be out of the range of any shotgun. Sheriff Ed didn't think George could have a good rifle in his possession. The only weapons the boy had, to his knowledge, was the old shotgun and maybe a hunting knife. The last island they had passed was the ambushers' only possibility until they neared the creeks that led to the farms of the Jones family. Just as the men relaxed and exchanged their poles for the oars, a shotgun blast came from the island they had just passed. As soon as the wily sheriff heard the first shot, he dropped down into the bottom of the dugout beside the body of Jetty. The second shot came right on the heels of the first one. The sheriff could hear the buckshot hitting the sides of the dugout, and he thanked the Lord for not making it possible for the bushwhacker to have a rifle. If he had a long-range rifle, the men in the slow-moving boats would have been gone. As the sheriff kept his head down, he heard the shots coming from the front of his boat. Jericho was returning the fire of the bushwhacker, taking his time and firing with a slow cadence. The sounds of repeated firing came from the other boat as Jake emptied his rifle into the shadows of the island they had just passed. He fired without aiming, content to fire off as many rounds as he could. It is always that way when a desperate man shoots. For his life. Sonny Boy had been hit by the first blast and knocked from the boat. Jake had watched his brother go into the water, then had turned and began shooting with reckless abandon toward the source of the shotgun blasts. Folks, I'm going to take a pause for the cause just because. Whew. Come on, damn it, work. Whoo-wee, what up, y'all? Salute. Pardon the technical difficulties. So let me take a second, man. Oh, boy. All right, y'all. I'm glad y'all here with me in the place to be. A second. Alrighty. Man of God in a place to be, y'all. Alright. We're gonna knock this book out, y'all. Let's do it. Let's knock it out. Chapter 13. George watched the sky closely, hoping that the coming storm would reach him before the men came out of the swamps. It would be a help, he reasoned, if the rain would come down. In the darkness of the storm, he would be able to move closer to his prey without being seen. He would be able to move closer to his prey without being seen. His eyes searched the small islands as he pulled slowly down the creek. It would have to be just the right spot if he wanted to come out of it alive. He was sure he could get one of the men, but he knew that as soon as he fired at them, they would return his fire using better rifles. The long-range rifles that some of the posse carried made it mandatory that he pick the perfect spot for them. Made it mandatory that he picked the perfect spot for his ambush. He didn't want to kill just one of them and let the rest escape. As he searched the nearby riverbanks, he promised himself that he would make sure this time to kill at least one of the Jones boys. He reflected bitterly on the killing of the deputy. He remembered the man and regretted having shot him, but it had been necessary. The deputy had been one of the few white men who had been kind toward them. He remembered the man from his last visit to their cabin. He had shown up one morning and asked to see Henrietta. When George had told him that Henrietta wasn't there, the tall, dark-complexioned man had pushed past him and gone into the cabin where Henrietta had been sitting. After a few minutes, the man returned, and George could have sworn that there were tears in the man's eyes as he walked away from George, swearing under his breath. After that, George had seen the man only one more time. He had come from down river, traveling over the land. In his hands, he carried a small bag. This time, he didn't ask for Henrietta. He just held out the bag for George. As soon as George had taken it, the man had turned around and left. George figured it must have been at least a 15-mile walk coming the way the man had come. After he left, George opened the bag and saw that it contained jawbreakers, the candy that Henrietta loved to eat. Yes, he reflected. It had been a very bitter thing he had done. Had he taken his time and noticed which white man he was sighting down on, he would have held his fire. But he hadn't seen him until after the man had fallen. Then it was much too late. Now he knew the man's brother would never give up until he killed George or George killed him. George had never known their names, but he knew them on sight. Two quiet white men who minded their own business, and they were both good hunters. George was sure of that after spying on them a couple of times when he saw them back in the swamps. Finally, George came to the last island before reaching the large lake that led to the Jones farm. If he didn't do it here, he'd have to row down to the farm and wait for them there. He quickly rejected the idea of ambushing them at the farm. It was much too dangerous an idea. Even if he were lucky enough to bring down one or two of the men, the others could easily overtake him in the open water as he rowed back into the swamps. No, he would have to make his ambush work from here, the last island. The one thing that was in his favor was that by the time they reached here, they would begin to relax. After sweating their way past all the narrow islands, they would almost certainly begin to feel as if they were home free. Having made up his mind to ambush them from the to ambush them from the last island before the Big Bend. George debated with himself on whether or not he would have enough time to take his dugout around the island and place it where it would do the most good. If he could hide it on the other side of the island, if he could hide it on the other side of the if he could hide it on the other side of the island, he would have made it. He would have it made. Once he cut loose on the white men, all he would have to do would be to make a run for his boat. If the men pursued him, he would just have to reach his boat before they caught him and shove off. Then the white men would be left on the island without their boats. They'd have to retrace their steps all the way back to where they had landed before they could. They'd have to retrace their step. They'd have to retrace their steps all the way back to where they had landed before they could continue the chase. By that time, George figured he could cut back into his well-concealed waterway and head for home. What was left of the posse would never find out which waterway he took away from the open lake. It was a good plan, except for the fact it meant that some of the posse would be left alive. Navy Knave in the place we crave. I am late, I have to rewind, but thank you for reading to us. Navy Knave, thank you for joining us. By that time, George figured he could cut back into his well-concealed waterway and head for home. What was left of the posse would never find out which waterway he took away from the open lake. It was a good plan, except for the fact it meant that some of the posse would be left alive. Shit, that must be harder than it looks to read in front of a camera. Jasper Abbott, thank you for joining us. Yeah, this is Ralph Reads Raw, man. This is where I record books for my podcast. Now, because this is raw, I'm going to mess up. I'm going to say things over and over again. So if you have the patience of dealing with that, then maybe you can see what I finally do behind the scenes, So have at it. Have a snack, smoke a blunt, and join us. And thank you for being here on Ralph Reads Raw. Now, it was a good plan, except for the fact it meant some of the posse would be left alive. He desperately wanted to kill them all. Maybe, thought George, he could stay on the island and kill them one at a time, and kill them one at a time as they tried to track him down. It was possible if he moved right, but it would be touch and go. Each man he was after was a well-armed hunter. Each one had experience in hunting down black men, so he would be up against well-trained men. Whatever the odds, he had to make sure he did a good, complete job. If he left one man alive, it would mean that Henrietta would have to live the rest of her life in the back swamps because he would never be able to come out. As George thought about it, he realized that the sheriff would never give up hunting him until one of them was dead. So be it, he reasoned. It was about to be to the death. As long as he was able to drop all of the Jones boys, he would be able to die in peace. George thought about Henrietta and hoped that she always got patience for a good book. Smoking and snacking already, brother. Respect from the UK. Salute to the United Kingdom. Much love to y'all, man. I stay checking on y'all every day, and every day y'all on that list. Checking in. and I am appreciative. Thank you. Thank you so much. George thought about Henrietta and hoped that she stayed in the cabin until he returned. If she left it, she might get lost trying to find her way among the weed-covered trails. Then there was always the threat of the quicksand. George cursed himself for not taking the time to show her the quicksand so she would have known about it. But as he thought about it, he realized that it wouldn't have done any good because 10 minutes after he explained it to her, she would have forgotten what he had told her. No, the swamps were no place for Henrietta. She couldn't last a month unless he stayed right beside her. He wondered if it might be possible to take her along with him whenever he had to hunt. It would be the only way. He was sure of it. He promised himself that once he got back, he would never leave her alone again. No matter what he had to do, he would just have to drag her along. If that was the case, George reasoned, the only recourse he had was to play the game out to the end, right here and right now. He picked up his oars and rowed around the bend. He moved swiftly now. He wanted to find a place to hide the boat, not so much for an escape, but somewhere where the whites couldn't find it once they came ashore. Whether they knew it or not, the island would be their battleground. George was determined not to leave until every last white was dead. George patted the shotgun shells. He had in his pocket. Only 10 were left. If he could cut down the old sheriff and somehow reach the body, he could get his hands on some more shells. It was something to keep in mind, he reflected. Also, there was a chance of knocking off Jake Jones. Then he could get his hands on his father's rifle. If he succeeded in doing that, he would be keeping the promise he had made over his father's grave to one day kill the bastard who had killed him for the rifle. Just the thought of it filled George with a stormy rage. Jake Jones had been a curse to his family ever since he could remember. But if things went right this day, he would more than even the score. There wouldn't be a Jones brother left alive. An old oak tree that had been struck by lightning sometime in the past caught his attention. He rode the dugout toward it, wary of any snakes that might have made the old limbs their home. Some of the roots were buried deep in the water, and he moved around them carefully. This would be one hell of a time to get a snake bite. It would be the end of the white man's worry because this far away from any medical help, he would be lost. The blood poisoning was set in before he could even reach his cabin in the swamps. The bank was high. George had to struggle with the boat to get it up out of the water. Once on dry land, he pulled and pushed until he got the dugout completely out of the water. But he couldn't find anywhere close at hand to conceal it. If for any reason he had to leave in a hurry, he would have a hell of a time getting it back to the water. But that was the chance he'd have to take. He glanced out over the water. There was the bend on the left that led back toward his cabin. There was the bend on the left that led back toward his cabin, and it wouldn't take but a few minutes of fast rowing before he reached it. Still, his back would be exposed to the men with rifles as he rowed down toward the turnoff. Once again, he was convinced that he would have to kill everybody on the island before he attempted to make his run. George got behind the dugout and shoved it deeper into the wooded section. He stopped and wiped his brow. All he needed now was to cover the boat up with brush and a few weeds so that the men who would be searching for him wouldn't find it. It would be a fatal irony if they tried to escape the death trap he had planned for them with his very own boat. An irony he knew an irony he knew would plague him forever. Once he finished covering the boat, George stood back and examined his work carefully. Noticing a slight gap in the camouflage, he searched the nearby terrain until he found some tall weeds. With the help of his long hunting knife, he quickly cut them loose and carried the weeds back to the dugout to stick them over the gap. Again, he stepped back and checked on his work. It wouldn't fool anyone who was searching for the boat, he thought, but it would pass as scenery to anybody who didn't know where to look. Satisfied with his work, George picked up his shotgun and started across a small island. He searched the brush ahead of him. Even with the heavy high-back boots he wore, he was taking a chance with the snakes. He started to search for a green branch. As soon as he saw one about the size he needed, he stopped and cut it down. After that, George could breathe a lot easier. The brush was too dense for a man to try and travel through without some kind of stick. He used the pole as he walked, striking the ground ahead of him to arouse any of the poisonous reptiles that might be in his path. Before he had finished crossing the island, the stick paid off. Right before he went through some heavy brush, he stuck the stick down into the high weeds and swung it back and forth. A loud hissing sound came to him. He backed up quickly, searching the nearby ground. As if drawn from its lair, a long, dark-colored snake as if drawn from its lair, a long, dark-colored snake came wiggling out. The reptile was in an ill mood, angry because something had the nerve to disturb it. As George watched it work toward him slowly, his mouth formed the unspoken words. Cottonmouth, the most vicious snake in the swamps. Ill-tempered most of the time, ready to bite at all times. As the snake began to coil, George could see the white spot inside the open mouth that gave it its name. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and brought the stick down across the snake's curling body. Better for him to launch the attack than to wait for the snake to decide to strike. The stick was too thin to really kill the long, heavy-bodied snake, but it did what George hoped for. As the snake came out of its coil, George struck it again across the back. George struck it again across its back. This time, the long branch broke in half. Using the short half that he was left with, George swung it like a baseball bat. He continued attacking on the reptile. His continued attack on the reptile kept the snake from curling up into its deadly coil. The unrelenting attack made the fully aroused snake change its mind. Instead of wanting to attack its assailant, now the reptile only wanted to escape. Water was its domain, and as soon as the chance presented itself, the snake gave up the brief skirmish and slithered into the thick underbush toward the less demanding environment. George shook his head and wiped the sweat from his brow. It could have been a hell of a lot worse, he reasoned as he thanked his lucky stars for taking the time to pick up the stick. Now that the danger was past, he didn't let his guard down. Pit vipers were everywhere, this being the time of the year for the young ones to come forth. Once a water moccasin gave birth to its young ones, one second. Once a water moccasin gave birth. I can't believe these trucks backing up. One second, y'all. Once a water moccasin gave birth to its young ones, they were on their own. They didn't come from an egg. Like humans, the baby water moccasins were born live. Were born live. Once again, the sound of thunder shattered the stillness of the swamps, and the birds and other small animals went wild, frightened by the roar. The birds flew from one tree to another, then back where they had started from. In the underbush, the larger animals moved about nervously. Threats of rain in the swamps could spell danger for many of its inhabitants. Water would seep down into their lair and drown many of them, while others would be trapped in the sand pits and other small holes used for shelter. The pathways became less dense as George neared the riverbank. He caught himself breathing hard from the earlier excursion. Unknowingly, he had picked up the pace and he neared the river and was almost running. He had to be careful because the woods carried sounds over extreme distances. When George heard the voices from the river, he began to run, disregarding the dangers underfoot. When he reached the riverbank, he saw that he was almost too late. He cursed silently. In another minute, he would have missed his victims. As he peered out of the brush, he could see instantly that he would never be able to ambush as many of the posse as he had hoped to. Without hesitating, George raised his shotgun to his shoulder and took aim. If he wasted another second, the men in the dugouts would be out of the range of his shatter gun. As he took aim, he cursed inwardly as he recognized the man in his sights. Instead of it being the hated Jake Jones, it was the cowardly Sonny Boy. Well, he reassured himself, since he meant to kill all of them eventually, he'd have to be satisfied with just Sonny Boy for now. Because of the way the men had placed the dugouts, it would be impossible for him to knock off more than just one. The recoil of the shotgun slammed him backward. Before he could really take good aim, he raised the weapon and fired again. Quickly, he broke the gun down and inserted 2 more shells. By the time he got the gun back into firing position, rifle bullets began to thump loudly against the trees and whistle overhead. George took the shotgun down from his shoulder as he watched the frantic efforts of the men out on the water. Since they were now out of his range, he could only observe their actions. He smiled coldly as he watched Sonny Boy keel over and fall into the water. Finally, Jake stopped firing his rifle and went to the aid of his brother. George started to raise the shotgun to his shoulder, but realized that it would be a wasted effort. The men were definitely out of range now. The underwater current had slowly moved the awkward dugouts downriver. George watched Jake struggling to get his brother back in the boat. George watched as Jake, struggling to get his brother back on the boat, fell overboard. The oldest brother grabbed the lifeless body and clung to it, sobbing like a baby. Jake knew instantly that Sonny Boy was dead. He cursed in frustration, but every time he opened his mouth, he took in water. Using as much caution as possible, Sheriff Ed worked his boat over until he was beside the empty dugout. With Jericho and the sheriff, Jake finally got Sonny Boy and himself back into the boat. Then, with Jericho scanning the riverbank for any sign of the sniper, they slowly rowed the two boats back towards the island, making sure to give a lot of room to the area from which they suspected the shotgun shots had come. George watched them approach, seeing that they hoped to land downriver from where he was. He moved back into the brush and started making his way towards the approaching men. That son of a bitch is gonna be waiting for us. Jericho, the sheriff stated, his eyes probing the bushes and trees sounding the island's riverbank. I hope the bushwhacking cocksucker don't get away, Jake yelled from his boat. He glared down at his two brothers stretched out on the bottom of the boat. Just have a little patience, Jake, the sheriff cautioned. Our boy is waiting. You can bet on it. He hesitated, then continued. Jericho, if that nigga was watching, he's running like hell right now through the bush trying to cut us off. So I think the best bet for us would be to swing way round the island and come back on foot. I reckon, Jericho answered abruptly. All he wanted was to get a clean shot at whoever was ambushing them. Jake cursed fruitlessly. The men were tired and angry. Fear was riding on their shoulders. Each man felt it in a certain way. While the sheriff desired to meet it head on, he still felt the fear like he had never known before. Swing wider, Jericho, the sheriff instructed. We don't want to give that bastard another shot at us. Jericho mumbled something under his breath, but he still followed the sheriff's instructions. I don't reckon that coon can run through them bushes as fast as we can move down the river, Jericho stated, keeping his eyes turned towards the danger area. That's sure in the hell right, Ed answered. I reckon we ain't got to go much farther, for we're going to put our feet on some dry land. No matter how hard Jake rowed, he couldn't keep up with the sheriff. When he glanced up and saw Sheriff Ed turning toward the shore, he felt relief. There were few men, he believed, who could move through woods as silently as he could. If the nigger hadn't left, he was sure they could flush him out. And what a time he'd have then, he thought coldly. If he had anything to do with it, he swore silently that he would personally cut the black bastard's nuts off. 3 of the men breathed easier once they reached the river's bank without being shot at. Being out on the river made them feel like sitting ducks. Quickly, the 3 men pulled the 2 boats out of the water, then removed Sonny Boy from the bottom of the dugout and placed him on dry land. A blind rage overcame Jake as he examined the wound in his brother's back. "That dirty son of a bitch shot Sonny in the back," he swore angrily, then grabbed the sheriff's arm and made him look at the wound. "You see that, Ed? Done shot my brother in the back, the cowardly black bastard!" Jake broke down sobbing loudly and holding his head in his hands as he went to his knees. The sheriff looked away. "Jake, you better pull yourself together, old boy. You got another brother here who needs your help." At the mention of his name, Zeke let out a groan. The pain in his stomach had stopped for a minute. When he twisted around, all he could see were the sides of the dugout. He tried to cry out for the men to come and get him out. He tried to cry out for the men to come and get him out of the boat, but no words came from his lips. "I reckon we better set out, Ed," Jericho stated, looking warily around the heavily weeded area. Somebody gonna have to stay here with Zeke, Sheriff. I don't reckon he'd like waking up and finding everybody gone." Sheriff Ed began to rub his jaw. "Jake, I reckon the job falls to you to see that your brother is all right. We can't just go stalking off into the woods and leave him alone." Jake looked up angrily from where he knelt in the dirt. "By God, Ed, you can't do it. I got just as much right to go after that coon as the next man." He turned to Jericho and glared, his jaw sticking out like a bulldog's. "It ain't that we want to leave you behind, Jake," the sheriff began. "But it's your brother, and some damn body should stay and look after him. Hell's fire, you can't tell what might happen if we go off and leaving him by himself." "We're just wasting time standing around fussing about it, Ed," Jericho stated. "If we hurry, we might just catch us a coon running crazy through the woods." As he talked, he fingered his late model rifle. All he wanted was one good shot at the coon. Then he would see about taking care of the remaining Joneses boys. Lightning broke out over them, followed by the sound of thunder. The sky darkened as the men stood there arguing, and they realized at once that the rain had finally caught up with them. Large drops began to fall with increasing regularity. "I reckon we done everything we can, Jake, so we best be getting on if we hope to catch that boy before he runs for cover." The sheriff knew the man they sought wouldn't be hunting for cover. Somewhere out there in the woods was a crazy black man. A crazy black man was hunting for them, just as they would be hunting for him. Nothing would stop the man, the sheriff knew, but death. How you reckon we ought to go about doing this, Sheriff?" Jericho inquired. "I mean, should we split up so we can cover more ground or work together?" We'll stay together for a while, Jericho. This boy's dangerous as all hell." Jericho shrugged his shoulders and stared down at the riverbank. Neither man glanced back at Jake as they left. After they had gone a few feet, the sheriff spoke up. I don't reckon we ought to stick by the riverbank, he said as he stopped and broke off a long, slim green branch. Sheriff Ed tossed a stick to Jericho, then broke off another one for himself. We best not be taking too many chances, boy. Walking down near the edge of the river ain't nothing doing but inviting trouble. I reckon you're right about that, Jericho answered as he waved his stick back and forth, weighing its balance. It's more pit vipers crawling around down near the water. It's more pit vipers crawling around down near the water than it's more pit vipers crawling around down near the water than it is back in the brush. The sheriff agreed with him. Seems to me we might do better if we headed in a little more deeper. Jericho. But I think our coon is hugging the riverbanks, searching for us, since he don't know where we pulled in. Suddenly, Sheriff Ed saw some motion out of the corner of his eye. He stopped abruptly in his tracks. Jericho came up beside him. It ain't nothing but a blue racer, Jericho said as they watched the fast-moving snake disappear into the nearby brush. Let's hope the rest of them crawling bastards we come across turn out to be racers too, the sheriff stated. There was a note of relief in his voice. Blue racers would leave a man alone if the man left them alone. Being too swift to catch, the gracefully moving reptiles wanted only their isolation. Jericho let out a laugh. I reckon you're thinking along the same lines as me, Ed. Praying we don't stumble over some of them ornery-ass cottonmouths. If we should happen to, he continued, these little switches you plucked up ain't gonna be much use. Sheriff Ed patted his pistol. I reckon I got something here that will handle any cottonmouth we might come across. Yeah, Jericho drawled slowly. I reckon it will put any of them out of their troubles. Only problem about that bucket of grapes is that we need to see them black bastards before we feel one of them. It was impossible for the sheriff not to understand what his deputy was getting at. The sky had darkened, and now the swamp was getting pitch black. Soon, neither man would be able to see his hand in front of him. If they stumbled over any snakes, there would be no warning, only the sudden pain where the reptile had struck. As the sheriff thought about it, he reached back on his belt and removed his flashlight. It's gonna be blacker than a witch's heart in a few more minutes, Jericho, so if you want to go back to the dugouts, I can well understand it. You ought to know better than that, Ed. That coon done killed my kid brother. Ain't no way I'd turn back now. Though I hate being caught in any swamp at night. I'll go on until I see that nigger stretched out in front of us. Jericho removed his flashlight and switched it on. I reckon if that black boy can run around out here hunting for us, we can do the same thing to him. I reckon you got a point there, the sheriff answered, leading the group away from the riverbank. As he moved deeper into the swamps, he realized it wasn't only the black man he feared. He also feared the unknown, the sudden death that lay in wait for anybody foolhardy enough to walk through the backwaters after darkness fell. All right, y'all, let me take a second. Whew. Lord. God, Lord. Whew. Looks hot as hell where you are in the southern U.S. Great book. Never read a Goines before. Let me answer that question in the quickness. I am from New York City and I stay in NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, the projects. And it's quite the lore to know that all NYCHA apartments have this thing called Project Heat. Today in New York City, there was, hold on, let me pause for the cause here. Today in New York City reached 86 degrees. 86 degrees, like out of nowhere. It happens here springtime now. We used to have a kind of springtime, but now it's no longer winter into springtime, then summer. No, it's winter, then summer, like that. So, because of that, the engineers, I don't even think they do the work in their boiling room or whatever. Because even though it was 80 degrees today, they still had on the Project Heat. The Project Heat in the wintertime is too much. However, I'm grateful. But God, Lord, does it have to be that much heat? It's crazy. It was 80 degrees, 85 degrees today, damn near 90 degrees today. And they still have the heat on in my apartment. So yeah, it sucks pretty much. So if you don't mind, let me take something out of the United Roman Networks pack. Oh, wow. All right. This is it. Tell a friend to tune in. Please join for 99 cents a month per month so that you can get the uncensored versions of these very shows. Because when I stylize them, yes, I make PG-13 versions or TV-14 versions, and as well as TVMA versions or mature audience versions as well. So the 99 cents that y'all pay every month will access y'all to the uncensored versions of everything I put in here. And of course, Ralph Reed's Raw is free all around. Every time I'm on, you'll see me performing live for y'all, you know. Even though, sadly, I will mess up, I am not exactly trying to entertain folks. I'm just recording, right? Now, if I were on the TED Talk stage, I would work that much harder to make sure I don't mess up. But since this is Ralph Reed's Raw, and y'all seeing what I do behind the scenes, you get what you get. And it's all raw. It's all brand new. It's all off the top of the head. It's reading the book, whatever. Let's get it done. And speaking of done, this book's about done. Let me read the last chapter. Let's go, let's go. Chapter 14. When the storm broke, wow, man, you can't even control the heating and it's on for no reason. Improper waste of resources. Exactly. They don't care. They feel they got an abundance of it. And that's why it sucks so bad. Chapter 14. When the storm broke, it broke suddenly. Rain came down in a heavy downpour. George stayed close to the riverbank, wondering how far down the sheriff and his remaining posse had gone. The rain was a blessing in one way and a curse in another. Most of the water snakes will be coming out of their dens and moving to the river. As darkness settled over the swamp, George cursed himself silently for leaving the flashlight. Now he was at the mercy of the elements. After passing the third large snake that he couldn't identify, he started working his way. He started working his way away from the river. It was too dangerous to be close to the water, he reasoned, as he went into the brush. The rain felt good on his skin. For a minute, he debated on whether or not he should take his shirt off. The rainwater would feel good on his bare skin, but later it would turn cold. He felt his stomach grumbling and realized that he hadn't eaten all day. It would soon be over, he told himself as he cautiously went through the dense brush. A hanging vine gave him a sudden start. He pushed it back from his path and continued on. After swinging the new green branch, broken down to replace the broken one he had used on the reptile earlier, he would take a couple of steps. It was a slow progress, but it was the only way he could be sure he didn't step on some pit viper. The long pole that he used disturbed the creatures that were in his path. He only had to swing it and then wait, straining his eyes to make sure that whatever he disturbed went on its angry way. Once, George pulled back the pole and found that a large snake had wrapped itself around the end of it. Frantically, he smashed the pole against the nearest tree, shaking the reptile loose. Suddenly, to his right, George saw a light flashing through the trees. He knew at once what it was. He hid behind a wide oak tree and waited until the men were opposite him. He could barely distinguish the outline of the two figures. Once, where the man in the rear moved in his flashlight, George saw the sheriff clearly. He wanted to move closer so that he could get a better shot if Jake Jones happens to be the man in the rear. The sound of their voices came to him, and he suddenly understood what had happened. One of the men had stayed back at the boat. Trucks. I knew that was going to happen. One of the men had stayed back at the boat, and if that was the case, it meant that Zeke must still be alive. George closed his eyes and tried to remember everything he had seen while he had first ambushed them. He remembered how much care the men had taken with Zeke. Could the hillbilly still be alive? He had taken a full load of buckshot right in the gut. If Zeke was indeed still alive, it would explain why Jake wasn't along with the sheriff. George could not think of any other reason for the man not being out in the woods searching for him. He was sure it wasn't from fear. After seeing two of his brothers cut down, Jake would be roaring to get on his trail. The men passed in easy reach of George's shotgun range, but he decided to let them pass. He could always circle round and cut them off whenever they decided to give up the senseless chase in the darkness. It wouldn't take them much longer to realize just how stupid it was for them to be stumbling around in the brush. Before the sound of the men's voices had grown dim, George had started to make his way toward where they had come from. He realized at once that he would have to get back to the riverfront and follow it if he was to have any hope of ever finding Jake. Without hesitating, he started in the direction of the river. Now he moved fast, taking the risks he hadn't taken before. His prey was somewhere ahead of him, and he meant to find it. It couldn't have happened any better if he had planned it himself. George was hardly 10 minutes down the trail when the sheriff tossed up his hand. Jericho! I've been a fool many times in the past, and might be one of the times in the future, but boy, we're doing one of the most damn foolish stunts a man ever did. Even before the sheriff said it, Jericho knew what he was going to say. It was foolish of them to be out in the swamps searching for a man in the pitch blackness that surrounded them. At first, before it got dark, it had seemed like a good idea. Grand rising to 704 Liquor House Talks. Salute to you, brother. I'm glad you're here. And you're just in time for the last chapter of the book. Let me see. At first, before it got dark, it had seemed like a good idea. But now, when they really had a chance to experience the darkness, the truth came home. If the black man was crazy enough to be trying to find his way around in the darkness, all they had to do was sit back at the dugouts and let the swamp do their work for them. God dog! God dang! The sheriff roared and stopped abruptly. Jericho following close behind, almost bumped into him. What the hell? He yelled, almost dropping his rifle. Take a good look at what we almost stumbled into, Sheriff Ed stated, then flashed his light in front of them. At the sight of the quicksand in front of them, Jericho let out a sigh. Well, old timer, looks like the boy won this round after all. Just for a day, Ed replied sharply. As soon as the sun comes up, we'll be out looking for him. I don't reckon he'll go too far, seeing as he got the same idea as we have, the sheriff stated, nodding his shaggy head in agreement with his own words. Yeah, that boy wants a crack at us just as bad as we want at him. Just as bad as we want one at him. Hell's fire, Jericho. He ain't going nowhere at all. Even though both men had admitted their failure, they were both reluctant to turn around and go back. Ain't no reason for us to fool ourselves, Jericho. Whenever old swamp hounds like us damn near walk smack into some quicksand, it's time to stop and take stock of just what the hell we're doing. Without answering, Jericho wheeled around and started back the way they had come. For some reason, he had a guilty feeling. It was as if he was quitting on Jitty. Jitty wouldn't have given up the trail of the man who bushwhacked his brother. That was one thing Jericho was sure of. But this fumbling around in the dark wasn't getting them anywhere either. They could come within 5 feet of the nigger, Jericho reasoned, and they'd never know he was there. After all, the man was dark-skinned, so they wouldn't stand a chance of seeing him in this blackness. After getting on the sheriff's back trail, George moved down the hidden path swiftly. When he reached the river, he slowed down slightly, but continued on. He would have passed by the small camp in the darkness if he hadn't heard Zeke cry out in pain. At the sound of the wounded man's voice, George swung around and followed his nose. He could smell smoke. As he approached, he saw Jake bending down over a tiny fire that was about to go out because of the rain. Jake! Jake! His ailing brother called. Boy, you got to do something for me. The pain, boy. I can't stand the pain. It feels like somebody done poured boiling oil down inside me. Once George knew where the men were, he removed his pistol from under the belt. He removed the pistol from under his belt. Before the two brothers knew what was happening, George was standing in the small clearing they were using for their camp. Jake had his back to George, kneeling down over his only surviving brother. Never in his life had Jake shown so much kindness to Zeke. It had dawned on him that Zeke was the only brother he had left alive. The very thought of it filled him with a killing rage toward the black man who had done this to his family. If he could only see the nigger, he thought coldly. If he could only see the nigger, he thought coldly, he would kill the Jake with his bare hands. Now that is what I call a pretty sight. Wait. Now that is what I call a right. Now that's what I call a right pretty sight, George stated quietly as he walked up behind Jake. The tall white man jumped as though someone had stuck him with a knife. By God, he roared. You got the nerve! His eyes went to the pistol George held, causing him to stop. That's Jamie's pistol, boy. You done really did something to my younger brother. George laughed in his face. Nah, I ain't did nothing to him. Them gators back in the pond did it for me. Yes, sir. Them gators had a damn good time on all that stinking white meat. As he spoke, Jake's eyes grew large and cold. Boy, tell me the truth. You're just funning me, ain't you? We ain't did you no harm that would make you put my brother in that gator pool. He didn't want to believe it, even though he knew what the tall black man said. Even though he knew what the tall black man said was the truth. Jake, Zeke managed to say, that ain't the nigger who hurt me, is it? Both of the men ignored the sick man's words as they locked wills with each other. You hear that? George inquired. I'm sure glad the white bastard didn't die right off when I put them shotgun shells in his fucking stomach. I couldn't have hoped for anything better. George laughed wildly as he looked from one brother to the other. Jake finally realized that the young black meant to kill him. It was like an awakening. Boy, now you just listen to me. The sheriff gonna be back in a second, so you just give me that pistol, you hear? George laughed again. This time, it was even wilder. I'm sure plan on giving it to you, honky, he said calmly, pulling the trigger. The bullet caught Jake in the stomach, spinning him around as he fell to his knees. George approached and grabbed the front of the man's shirt. Raising the pistol, he brought it down sharply and broke the man's nose. The force of the blow tore Jake loose from the hold George had on his shirt. My God, boy, Zeke managed to say. You done went and shot old Jake. His voice wavered with disbelief and pain. As Jake fought back the pain that rushed up from his stomach, he could feel the boy pulling at his pants. He opened his eyes and blinked up at the black man. Boy, what you gonna do? Jake whines, sounding like a beggar. Please, boy, don't hurt old Jake. I never done you no dirt, he cried as he felt the dirty long johns ripped away from his body. Even with the cold rain falling on him, he could feel the black man's cold hands on his privates. His penis shriveled up as though it knew what was about to happen. Please, boy, please, Jake screamed, watching in horror as the tall black man removed his hunting knife from his belt. Without wasting any motions, George got a good grip on a tiny white penis and started to cut. The man's screams were music to his ears. Nigger! Nigger! What you doing to my brother? Zeke cried out over the screams. He tried to raise himself up, but fell back. What little strength he had was being drained by fear. George stopped for a second. Zeke cried out over the screams. He tried to raise himself up, but fell back. What little strength he had was being drained by fear. George stopped for a second. Why, I ain't doing nothing more than I'm going to do for you, Zeke. You just wait your turn. George returned to his butcher's work, and before he had finished, Jake had passed out from the pain. George bent down and shoved a tiny white piece of meat into Jake's mouth. The way the man was bleeding, George didn't believe he could live. To make sure, he leaned over and cut the small, dirty bag that held the man's nuts. When he raised back up, he glanced around to see where he could put them. These is the most useless things I ever saw, George remarked casually as he approached Jake. Without a backward glance, he tossed the sack back toward the tiny fire. Zeke stared at the man as he approached. The sight of what had happened to Jake had completely taken his mind off his stomach wound. He attempted to get up and run, but he was wounded too badly. George, Zeke begged, using the black man's first name for the first time in his life. George, I'm hurt already, boy. You done gut shot me. So ain't that enough? George didn't waste any time. He used the knife to cut away the man's pants. Quickly, he bent over and repeated the butchering job he had just done on Jake. Zeke's screams were not as loud as his brother's, and before George had finished cutting on the man, he died. The two men had just reached the river's edge when they heard the pistol shot. Jericho glanced back at the sheriff. You reckon it's what I think it is? Sheriff Ed shrugged his shoulders. He couldn't be sure. It wasn't thunder or lightning, though. That he was sure of. You just be careful, Jericho. I'd hate for something to happen to you at this here stage of the game. The men moved swiftly now, and the sound of a bull alligator came to them. Jericho took his eyes off the trail for a second and glanced back at the sheriff. You know as well as I do, Jericho, that ain't what we heard, Ed stated as he brought up the rear. You just better keep that darn light of yours on what's ahead of you. The sound of a scream came to them. It didn't sound human at first, but when it was repeated, both men knew it was a man. The scream was terrible, a cry of pure horror and pain that came from deep within the victim's soul. From deep within the victim's soul. The sheriff tried to move faster. Jericho took his eyes off the ground and glanced back at the sheriff. God damn, Ed, Jericho exclaimed. Then his feet slipped in the money bank and Jericho began to fall. Instantly, the sheriff flashed his light down the bank as Jericho rolled. The beam fell on a dark shape coming out of the water. The beam fell on a dark shape coming out of the water. The sheriff yelled without a warning. Watch it, Jericho! On your left, boy! It's a viper! George couldn't break his fall, but he could throw his body to the right, changing his direction. As he slipped down the muddy bank, Sheriff Ed grabbed at his holstered pistol. The sudden arrival of the man sliding down the bank disturbed the huge water snake. It began to go into a coil at once. Jericho was too much of an expert to be bitten without putting up with the fence. He had been fond of saying that any man who saw a snake and still was bitten by it was a fool. As the reptile went into his coil, Jericho brought his rifle over. Lying in the mud of the bank, he half sat up as he swung the rifle like a baseball bat, catching the snake with a solid blow. The sound of the barrel hitting the reptile was loud. He lifted the snake up from the bank and knocked it back into the darkened water. He didn't hit you, did he, boy? The sheriff asked sharply as he kept the flashlight moving around the muddy bank, trying to see if there was any more vipers about. Jericho shook his head as he got up and made his way back up the small incline. Nah, he didn't hit me, Ed, but he scared the shit out of me. If you hadn't swung your light down there when you did, I'd never had seen the bastard, Jericho said, wiping the mud from his pants. I reckon my flashlight fell into the river. He finished lamely. Don't worry about it, Ed stated, then fell silent as loud screams came from the camp the two men had left. You better check on your rifle, though. Ed led the way back toward the camp, moving fast. They came up on the camp from the riverbank, each man walking softly. The sight they saw shook both men deeply. As they watched, Zeke was screaming for the last time. The sheriff stepped out into the clearing. Okay, boy, he began, but that was as far as he got. The tall black youth moved with the swiftness of a panther. His back had been turned to the men, and at the sound of the sheriff's voice, George dropped to one knee and came up with the long-barreled pistol. The sheriff was taken completely by surprise. The young black had moved so fast. The young black had moved so fast that the shotgun was almost useless to the old man. Even as the sheriff pulled the trigger, he realized he had fired over the kneeling man's head. Before George could pull the trigger of his pistol, Jericho stepped around the sheriff and shot him in the chest. The high-powered rifle made a thumping sound as the long shell struck the boy, knocking him off of his feet. Pain exploded in George's chest, and he suddenly remembered Henrietta. He had to get back and up to her. He had to get up and back. He had to get up and get back to her. He managed to fight his way back to his knees, but Jericho fired again. This time, the force of the blow took him backwards and down the riverbank. The black waters of the river surrounded him and welcomed him. The black waters of the swamp had finally gotten their man. I now have one book left in the Donald Goines bibliography. And I don't mind telling y'all, folks, that makes me feel a kind of way. Because as long as I had this channel, I've been reading Donald Goines' book. Sure, I didn't read them all at once. I knew I couldn't do that. But this is it, y'all. You know what I mean? Like, for the Donald Goines bibliography, I only got one more book to read, and that is Black Man's Grief, White Man's Justice, Black Man's Grief. That's what it's called. White Man's Justice, Black Man's Grief. That's the next book I gotta read. Well, I'm gonna put up a poll to see if y'all decide on Donald Goines. We'll see what's up with that. But as y'all know, Swamp Man is finished. And I'm gonna wanna thank you folks for joining me. 704 Liquor House Talk Network, Jasper Abbott, Navy Nave, Wild Donkey, Lady Rain, Lady J Ghoul, Dre Smooth. I'd like to thank you all. And I love you all like cooked food. I'm out of here, kids. I'm about to seriously get my smoke on before, and it's 4:22. How beautiful is that? With all of those things being said, y'all, let me just say these final words. I need you all to realize that life is short as hell. So, my advice to you all is to be with family as much as you can. If you guys in your family, if you happen to go through it, having arguments, having a disagreement of sorts, the disagreement is not worth your unity. It's not worth your blood. Unity matters. There is unity in strength. There's strength in unity. Without it, we're just a lost people. We need each other. We have to really respect each other when it comes to this, especially family members. Let's put God first for once, bro, and let's watch our families finally get some good for us, man. You know, I mean, we good, right? But let's hope for more good. Enough of this whack shit. Enough of this negativity, y'all. It's too much. It's surrounding us every day, all day. Let's keep our circle positive. and get rid of all that negative. Let's ignore all that, man. We got our own to work on. And we certainly have a lot of work to do. With all those things being said, stay sexy. It becomes y'all. I'll see you folks on the next edition of Ralph Reads Raw. Peace.